What happens in 9 seconds? A heartbeat accelerates, a breath is held, a decision crystallizes. But can 9 seconds change the entire hierarchy of rock and roll? Can 9 seconds of deliberate silence transform mockery into respect, doubt into awe, dismissal into surrender? Freddie Mercury proved they can. London, 1974. A small, prestigious club where the industry's elite gathered to decide who mattered and who didn't. Led Zeppelin, the undisputed kings of rock, the gods whose approval or dismissal could make or destroy careers, were backstage. And they were laughing at Queen, laughing at the theatrical newcomers with their operatic harmonies and velvet capes and satin costumes that violated every rule of what rock and roll was supposed to be. Too flamboyant, they whispered among themselves, voices carrying the certainty of men who owned the genre and knew its boundaries. This isn't real rock. They'll never make it. Brian May heard them and felt rage tightening his chest. Roger Taylor wanted to throw his drumsticks at their smirking faces. John Deacon's jaw clenched with quiet fury. But Freddie Mercury, standing in the wings adjusting his velvet jacket with hands that didn't shake, despite the insults floating through the air like poison, was utterly silent. He heard every word, every dismissive laugh, every prediction of Queen's inevitable failure. And he said nothing. Just stood there with dark eyes reflecting a fire nobody had seen yet, a calm that felt almost dangerous in its completeness. Because Freddie Mercury understood something the giants of rock didn't. Words are cheap, easily spoken, and quickly forgotten, but 9 seconds of silence followed by the right sound can rewrite history. This is the story of those 9 seconds. What happened before them, what happened during them, and what happened after, when the laughter died and the kings of rock realized they'd made a terrible miscalculation about the immigrant boy in the velvet jacket who looked like he didn't belong, but sounded like he owned the world. To understand that night, you have to understand who Freddie Mercury was in 1974. Not the legend in the yellow jacket commanding Wembley Stadium, not the icon whose voice would define a generation. Just Farrokh Bulsara, a Zanzibar-born immigrant boy who'd spent his entire life being told in 1,000 subtle and not-so-subtle ways that he didn't belong. The rock establishment of the early 1970s was a fortress built on very specific ideas about authenticity, raw masculinity, blues-based guitar riffs, a certain kind of working-class British swagger or American rebellion, no theatricality, no opera, no satin capes or elaborate stage productions, just power chords and attitude and the understood boundaries of what constituted real rock and roll. Queen violated every single one of those rules. Their music incorporated opera, vaudeville, music hall traditions. Their live performances featured costume changes and theatrical lighting. Freddie's stage presence was deliberately flamboyant, drawing from sources that had nothing to do with blues or rebellion and everything to do with performance art and spectacle. To the establishment, to bands like Led Zeppelin, who represented everything rock and roll was supposed to be, Queen looked like a joke, a gimmick. Theatrical pretenders who'd arrived at the wrong party wearing the wrong clothes and would be gone within a year once audiences realized they weren't authentic. Led Zeppelin's dismissal wasn't casual, it carried weight. When Robert Plant or Jimmy Page expressed doubt about a band's legitimacy, the industry listened. Their skepticism could kill careers before they started, could ensure that radio stations didn't play certain records, that promoters didn't book certain venues, that critics approached certain bands with preloaded contempt. For Queen, facing this wall of establishment doubt, Led Zeppelin's mockery was more than insulting. It was potentially career-ending. The message was clear. You don't belong here, you'll never belong here, and we'll make sure everyone knows it. The venue that night was one of London's prestigious clubs where industry insiders gathered. Not a massive stadium or arena, an intimate space where everyone could see everyone, where artists performed for other artists and critics and label executives who could make or break reputations with a single dismissive comment. The audience that night wasn't fans hoping to be entertained. They were skeptics who'd heard the rumors about Queen being theatrical pretenders, who'd been told by people they respected that this band was a gimmick unworthy of serious attention. They'd come to watch Queen fail, to confirm what Led Zeppelin had already decided, to participate in the dismissal of these flamboyant newcomers who didn't understand what real rock and roll required. Backstage before Queen went on, the tension was suffocating. Brian May was pacing, anger making his movements sharp and tense. Roger Taylor sat at his drum kit, hitting the skins with more force than necessary, each strike an expression of frustration at having to prove themselves to people who'd already decided they weren't worthy. John Deacon was quiet, which meant he was furious. John's silence always indicated deeper anger than anyone else's shouting. And Freddie stood apart from them, looking at himself in a mirror, adjusting his velvet jacket with movements that were perfectly calm, despite the storm of mockery happening just beyond the dressing room walls. "They're calling us a joke," Brian said, voice tight with controlled rage. "Let them," Freddie replied, still looking at his reflection, still adjusting his jacket with hands that showed no tremor. "We'll see who's laughing in an hour." The certainty in his voice wasn't bravado, it was something else. Something that came from a lifetime of being underestimated and having to prove himself over and over until the doubters ran out of arguments. Something that understood the specific power of silence, followed by sound, of letting mockery exhaust itself and then responding not with words, but with undeniable truth. The stage manager gave the signal. Queen walked out to an audience that was cold in the specific way that industry insiders are cold, arms crossed, expressions neutral, waiting to be impressed but expecting to be disappointed, ready to confirm their pre-existing judgments. Freddie Mercury approached the microphone at center stage. The lights were bright but not as elaborate as what Queen would later use, just enough to see him clearly. Every detail of his appearance that violated rock and roll's unwritten dress code. The velvet jacket, the carefully styled hair, the deliberate theatricality of his posture. Everything about him said, "I don't belong to your definition of authentic," and the audience saw it, and their skepticism deepened. Freddie didn't wave to the crowd, didn't smile, didn't offer the usual performer's greeting or attempt to warm up the room with banter. Just stood there at the microphone, one hand resting on the stand, the other at his side, looking out at the sea of crossed arms and skeptical faces. Then he did something that confused everyone watching. He closed his eyes. 1 second of silence. The audience waited for him to start singing, to prove or disprove everything they had heard about Queen's supposed lack of authenticity. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, still silent. Still standing there with eyes closed, hand on microphone stand, completely still. 4 seconds, 5 seconds. The audience began to shift uncomfortably. Was something wrong? Was he nervous? Had he forgotten the words? 6 seconds, 7 seconds. Someone in the back of the room laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the silence and seemed to confirm what everyone suspected. Queen was all image and no substance. Theatrical pretenders who couldn't deliver when it mattered. 8 seconds, 9 seconds. Then Freddie Mercury opened his mouth and everything changed. The first note didn't just fill the room. It obliterated the space where doubt had been living. A sound so pure and impossibly powerful that it felt physical, like the floor had dropped away, or gravity had reversed, or some fundamental law of physics had been suspended to allow this voice to exist. It wasn't loud in the sense of volume, though there was certainly power. It was loud in the sense of presence, of undeniability, of a truth so complete that arguing with it became impossible. The note sustained, perfect in pitch and control, demonstrating technique that couldn't be faked or manufactured through studio trickery. This was raw ability on display, stripped of any possibility of artifice. The audience's body language changed instantly. Arms that had been crossed, uncrossed. Spines that had been slouched, straightened. Eyes that had been skeptical widened with recognition that whatever they'd expected, this wasn't it. Backstage, where Led Zeppelin and other industry elites had been continuing their mocking conversation, the laughter died mid-sentence. Robert Plant stopped talking. Jimmy Page leaned forward slightly, head tilted, listening with the focused attention that one musician gives another when recognizing genuine ability. The dismissive smirks vanished from faces that had worn them confidently moments before. Because that first note, sustained with impossible control and devastating beauty, had answered every question about Queen's legitimacy, had made every criticism about theatricality versus authenticity irrelevant, had demonstrated that underneath the velvet jackets and elaborate staging lived a voice that couldn't be categorized or dismissed or explained away as gimmickry. Freddie opened his eyes and moved into the song, and for the next 90 minutes, Queen didn't just perform. They conducted a masterclass in what rock and roll could be when you refuse to be limited by other people's definitions of authenticity. Brian May's guitar didn't just play notes, it soared, creating textures and harmonies that demonstrated perfect technical ability married to genuine emotional expression. Roger Taylor's drums didn't just keep time, they thundered with precision and power that proved you could be theatrical and technically excellent simultaneously. John Deacon's bass didn't just hold down the rhythm. It created foundation that was both rock solid and musically sophisticated. But it was Freddie's presence that commanded the room, with the authority of someone reclaiming stolen territory. He moved across the stage with deliberate theatricality that now read not as compensation for lack of substance, but as additional dimension to already proven ability. The velvet jacket wasn't a costume hiding inadequacy, it was decoration on top of undeniable talent. The elaborate staging wasn't distraction from mediocre music, it was enhancement of excellent music. Every criticism that Led Zeppelin and the rock establishment had leveled at Queen, too theatrical, too operatic, not authentic enough, was being systematically dismantled, not through argument, but through demonstration. This was authentic. It was just authentic to something bigger and more inclusive than the narrow definition that had been used to exclude them. The audience transformed from skeptics to believers in real time. You could watch it happen. See the exact moments when individual listeners stopped resisting and surrendered to what they were experiencing. Arms that had been crossed moved to sides as bodies swayed slightly with the music. Expressions that had been neutral broke into smiles or looks of genuine surprise. People who'd come to confirm Queen's inadequacy found themselves unable to maintain that position in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. When the final song ended and the lights went down, the silence that followed was completely different from the silence that had opened the performance. Not the silence of skepticism waiting to be proven wrong. The silence of awe struggling to find appropriate response. Then the applause started. Not polite appreciation, but genuine enthusiasm from people who just had their expectations shattered and their definitions of rock and roll expanded, whether they'd wanted them expanded or not. Backstage, Led Zeppelin had gone quiet. The mocking conversation from earlier had evaporated. In its place was the specific silence that happens when people realize they've been wrong about something important and have to adjust their understanding of the world to accommodate new information. One of them accounts differ on whether it was Robert Plant or Jimmy Page walked to Queen's dressing room after the performance, found Freddie removing his velvet jacket, wiping sweat from his face, looking exhausted in the way that only complete artistic expenditure creates. The Led Zeppelin member didn't apologize, didn't reference the earlier mockery, didn't acknowledge having been wrong about Queen's legitimacy, just looked at Freddie for a moment and said 5 words. "You've got it. Respect." Then walked away, leaving Freddie sitting in front of a mirror with those 5 words that meant Led Zeppelin's wall of doubt had crumbled, that Queen had passed through fire and emerged recognized by the very people who tried to exclude them. That 9 seconds of silence followed by 90 minutes of undeniable excellence had rewritten the hierarchy of rock and roll in one night. But Freddie's response to that validation wasn't triumph. As Brian May entered the dressing room expecting to find Freddie celebrating their conquest of the skeptics, he found instead something unexpected. Freddie sitting very still, looking at his reflection, his expression not joyful but contemplative, almost sad. "We did it," Brian said, voice full of the victory he'd needed after hours of enduring mockery. "We showed them." "Yes," Freddie said quietly, still looking at his reflection. "We showed them tonight, and tomorrow we'll have to show them again. And the day after that, and the day after that. For the rest of our lives, we'll be showing them. Because they'll never just accept us. We'll always have to prove ourselves over and over until we're too exhausted to prove anything anymore." Brian didn't know what to say to that. He'd expected celebration, not this quiet recognition of what their victory actually meant. Not relief from judgment, but commitment to perpetual demonstration of worthiness. "Was it worth it?" Brian asked. Freddie turned from the mirror to look at him. Of course it was worth it. Because that first note proves something that I've known my whole life. They can doubt me, they can mock me, they can try to exclude me, but they can't make me less than I am. They can refuse to see it, but they can't make it not exist. He stood up, velvet jacket draped over one arm, exhaustion visible in every movement. But worth it doesn't mean easy, and it doesn't mean the battle's over. It just means we've proven we belong in the fight. That realization that proving themselves tonight didn't end the struggle, but committed them to repeating that proof indefinitely, was what Freddie whispered to Brian that nobody else heard. The secret that would define the rest of his career and explain the specific kind of exhaustion that would mark his later years. Led Zeppelin never mocked Queen again after that night. Other establishment figures who'd been ready to dismiss the theatrical newcomers reconsidered their positions. Critics who'd planned to write scathing reviews found themselves unable to deny what they'd witnessed. The 9 seconds of silence, followed by undeniable vocal power, had created a before and after in how Queen was perceived by the industry. But Freddie's recognition was darker and more accurate than simple victory. He'd understood in that dressing room that being undeniably excellent doesn't end doubt. It just forces doubt to find new forms. That no matter how many times you prove yourself, some people will always be waiting for you to fail so they can say they knew all along you were not authentic. That success doesn't mean acceptance. It means higher stakes for every subsequent performance. The pressure to maintain excellence because any slip will be used as evidence that the doubters were right from the beginning. For the rest of Queen's career, Freddie would carry that understanding. Every performance was another 9 seconds of silence where the world waited to see if he could still do it. Every album was another test where critics hoped to find evidence of decline. Every tour was another opportunity for people to declare that Queen had finally been exposed as the theatrical pretenders they'd always suspected. And every single time, Freddie would have to deliver that first perfect note again. Prove again that underneath the theatricality lived substance that couldn't be dismissed. Demonstrate again that he belonged in spaces that didn't want to make room for someone like him. The cost of that perpetual proving was never discussed publicly. Freddie maintained the theatrical persona, the confident stage presence, the image of someone who'd conquered all doubt and lived above criticism. But people close to him saw the exhaustion, the weight of knowing that no amount of success would ever be enough to stop having to prove himself, that he could fill Wembley Stadium and still encounter people who thought Queen was a gimmick, that he could create some of rock's most enduring music and still face skeptics who questioned his authenticity. The 9 seconds of silence in 1974 had won a battle, but it had also committed him to a war that wouldn't end until he did. A war against doubt and exclusion and narrow definitions of what rock and roll could be. A war he'd win night after night, performance after performance, until his body couldn't sustain the fight anymore. Years later, Brian May would talk about that night in 1974, when Queen faced Led Zeppelin's mockery and emerged victorious. Would describe the feeling of watching Freddie stand silent for 9 seconds while the audience grew uncomfortable and skeptical, then deliver a first note so perfect it changed the room's entire atmosphere. Would remember the look on Led Zeppelin members' faces as they realized they'd been catastrophically wrong about Queen's legitimacy. But Brian would also remember what Freddie said in the dressing room afterward, the quiet recognition that victory meant commitment to endless repetition of that victory. That being undeniably excellent didn't end the struggle. It just changed the terms. Freddie Mercury died in 1991. 17 years after those 9 seconds of silence proved Led Zeppelin wrong. In those 17 years, he'd proven himself thousands of times, had delivered that perfect first note over and over in venues around the world, had demonstrated excellence so consistently that eventually even the harshest skeptics ran out of arguments. But he never got to stop proving himself, never reached a point where his legitimacy was so accepted that he could rest on past achievement. Every performance was another 9 seconds where the world waited to see if he still had it. Every appearance was another test. Right up until the end, when illness made performing impossible, and he had to find other ways to prove that his voice, literal and metaphorical, still mattered. The 9 seconds in 1974 changed rock and roll's hierarchy by demonstrating that theatricality and authenticity weren't opposites, that you could wear velvet jackets and still possess undeniable talent, that opera and rock could coexist, that narrow definitions of authenticity were just limitations waiting to be exceeded. But those 9 seconds also locked Freddie into a pattern he couldn't escape, made him the permanent outsider who had to repeatedly prove he belonged inside, gave him victories that never translated to rest, made excellence his baseline, his minimum requirement, his perpetual burden. When people remember that night, they remember Freddie's triumph, the way he silenced the giants with nothing but his voice, the way 9 seconds of silence became the setup for a demonstration of power that couldn't be denied, the way Led Zeppelin stopped laughing and started respecting. But Freddie remembered something different. He remembered understanding in that dressing room that he just committed himself to a lifetime of repetition, that every night would be another version of those 9 seconds, another moment of silence where the world waited to judge him, another perfect note required to prove he deserved to exist in spaces that would rather exclude him. The victory was real, but so was the cost. And Freddie Mercury paid that cost every single night for 17 years until his voice went silent forever and the 9 seconds became permanent.